Thank you so much for coming. It's so exciting to see so many people here at an event. This is an opportunity to have a conversation that some of us have been having for decades, and others of us are just starting to have this conversation, and it's an opportunity to bring the conversation to here at GCC and to continue the conversation from here. What it is an academic conversation about a social movement that's happening and unfolding right before our eyes this last year. What it isn't is an opportunity to tell our personal stories, but we do have opportunities for that. And one of those opportunities is this student group, Collective Voices Common Ground, that's going to start next Wednesday. So if you want an opportunity to continue to talk about the issues that come up today, and especially about what we can do about it, you can come to that group. We're also going to have an opportunity for #MeToo storytelling workshop with Maria Williams. This came out of some work that Leo Wong and I have been doing with students and some faculty and staff as well this last year or so, year and a half, around diversity and inclusion issues. And a couple of students particularly kind of took it beyond our conversations and did a bulletin board, and I want to give them the opportunity to say something about that. So where's Lou Vincent and Sequoia LeBrew?
So we've got a board in the East Building on the east side, and we just want to encourage everyone to go check it out. The idea that we talked about in the Collective Voices Common Ground group is really about bringing the Me Too movement to campus and starting a conversation here about that. You want to say something?
Yeah, I think for Sequoia and I both, we recognize how we're culturally conditioned to not say anything, and it's actually really hard to say you're Me Too. So we wanted the board to be really inclusive. You can leave a mark without telling your story, without identifying yourself, and just feel that solidarity. So we're looking for support amongst ourselves here at GCC.
It's really great if you haven't had a chance. I know that the East Building is a very long walk over there. It's worth walking over there and checking it out. I also want to point out on the program are all the bios of these awesome panelists that we have today in there, and also in here is a bunch of resources. So this is a hard topic for everyone, I think, and there's also a couple of hotlines. If you're just a community member and not actually somebody associated with the campus, there's a couple of hotlines on the back you can call, and they can give you some resources, and there's free counseling available in the Valley as well. I also want to just thank the people who've been speaking up for the last year or so, and obviously people have been speaking up for forever, but who've actually been able to be heard. And also want to acknowledge the people who are not here today, who this issue is just still too hard to sort of be talking about in a public venue, so I'll acknowledge that they're not here. And I'm going to turn it over, for the sake of time, to Carrie Baker, professor from Smith College, who's going to moderate the panel today.
So I'm going to start by giving a little bit of historical context for this issue. As a teacher, I know that it's really important to understand the roots of issues and current manifestations of issues. So I wrote a book about 10 years ago called The Women's Movement Against Sexual Harassment. And in this book, I go back and I found the early activists who organized around this issue, the activists who coined the phrase sexual harassment, and I trace how they organized around this issue over a period of about 15 years. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about that story to kind of frame this conversation, and then we'll be hearing from each of the people up here. On a rainy Sunday morning in early May of 1975, 300 women gathered in an auditorium at a community center in Ithaca, New York, for the country's first Speak Out on sexual harassment, a phrase coined for the poster advertising the event. Women poured out their hearts, for the first time publicly sharing their stories of sexual abuse and coercion in the workplace. And they sparked a movement which within a decade had transformed behavior that women had experienced for generations and was considered part of the price women had to pay to participate in the workplace or in education, into a federal civil rights violation. The power of this movement and the reason for its effectiveness, I argue in my book, The Women's Movement Against Sexual Harassment, was its diversity. White women, black women, and other women of color, professional, pink-collar, blue-collar women, straight and lesbian women, women from rural and urban areas across the country came together to resist male abuse and harassment in the workplace. African American women brought every precedent-setting sexual harassment case all the way to the Supreme Court. Racist and sexist stereotypes melded in the harassment directed towards African American women, giving them a particularly clear understanding of the discriminatory nature of sexual overtures in the workplace. Informed by a history of race discrimination and sexual abuse, Black women did not mistake sexual harassment for harmless flirtation or excuse it as boys will be boys. They knew it was not about sex or flirtation. It was about power. Drawing on the ideas and resources of the African American community in the civil rights movement, these women filed lawsuits challenging sexual harassment as a form of sex discrimination in violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, building on racial harassment precedents in the law. Similarly, the background and identities of women working in blue-collar jobs, women of color and white women, shaped their experiences of sexual harassment and their activism. In male-dominated fields like mining and construction, women experienced men's hostility to their presence that often took the form not only of sexual harassment and abuse, but also of physical violence in order to push them out of these relatively high-paying workplaces. Blue-collar women knew, too, that this was abuse. This abuse was about power, not sex. Working through unions and employee associations, these women urged courts and policymakers to broaden their definitions of sexual harassment beyond a supervisor or a teacher's sexual demands of a subordinate employee to include what came to be known as hostile environment harassment, creating a hostile environment to push people out of the workplace or to make their lives miserable in the workplace. The women who organized the Speak Out in Ithaca, who later conducted the first surveys on sexual harassment, showing it to be widespread and damaging to women's health and careers, and who created a network of attorneys to help women experiencing harassment. These women were lesbian women who, like Black women, were very clear that sexual coercion in the workplace was about abuse of power. Black women continued to play a leadership role in the movement against sexual harassment over time. Think Anita Hill, which I assume you all know. 5 years ago, many of my students didn't know about her, but she's really, with the film Confirmation and the recent high profile that she's taken around these issues, I'm glad to say young people know who Anita Hill is. But also Tarana Burke. Do you know who Tarana Burke is? She's a social activist and community organizer who created the phrase Me Too in 2006 on the MySpace social network as part of a grassroots campaign to promote, as she said, empowerment through empathy among women of color who have experienced sexual abuse, particularly within communities of color. Burke has said that she was inspired to use the phrase after being unable to respond to a 13-year-old girl who confided to her that she had been sexually assaulted. Burke said she later wished she had simply told the girl, "Me too." Actress Alyssa Milano popularized the phrase last year on October 15th when she tweeted, and I quote, "If all the women who had been sexually harassed and assaulted wrote Me Too as a status, we might give people a sense of the magnitude of the problem." This tweet unleashed an explosion of stories about sexual harassment and abuse by women across the country and the globe, breaking through the shame, stigma, and disbelief that women have experienced forever. Women broke their silence in massive numbers. This explosion, I believe, was fueled by women's frustration about the attack on women's rights by the Trump administration and Republicans across the country, and by the fact that the country elected a man like Donald Trump, who, as we saw on the Access Hollywood video, has no respect for women and bragged about sexually assaulting them. Inspired by the Me Too movement, women across the country have mobilized against sexual harassment and assault, including here at GCC. Lou and Sequoia, thank you. You've brought the movement here to GCC by organizing the Me Too board in the East Building and participating in the creation of, as you say, solidarity and visibility for survivors of sexual assault and harassment, and through the student group Collective Voices. So I just want to say that I focus on the movement against sexual harassment because that's my area of research, but that movement was building on many previous movements, including the anti-rape movement, which emerged in the early 70s. The first Speak Out on rape was in the early 1970s, based in New York. But both of these movements grew out of a wide range of organizing in a wide range of movements going back to the 19th century. Movements against violence against women that grew out of the civil rights movement, the American Indian movement, a whole wide range of movements. These issues have come up, but they got really came together very powerfully in the early 70s, which is why that's the period that I focus on. But this activism has deep, deep roots. And if you want to know more about that, take my class, audit my class at Smith in the fall, because I've decided I've just got to teach a class on this, because it's a rich, deep history, and we can learn from that history. I think it's really important to learn from that history. I also just want to say personally, I remember October 15th. And I imagine many of you did too, when all of a sudden my Facebook page exploded with all these Me Too's. And I'm like, what's this? And then I started realizing my friends, my family, my students, my colleagues had these experiences. And I realized that I myself, who had been organizing and working around this issue for 30 years, had never said anything about my own experiences in high school and college. And I didn't at that moment, Me Too, on Facebook, but I did actually about a month or two ago, and partly inspired by my students, decide to finally report my own experiences 35 years later to the principal of my high school in Connecticut, and to Columbia University, where the person who had harassed me actually at Yale 30 years ago was now working, who promptly stepped down, not because of what I reported, but because of other women that had stepped forward in a New York Times story about him. And I decided to write a blog for Ms. Magazine about my own experiences. And all the mixed emotions and fear and ambivalence that's involved. But I realized I was just being a big wimp to teach about this stuff and organize around this stuff and never actually tell my own story. And so I empathize. I think that it's not the right time for everybody. Obviously, even when Me Too emerged, it took me several months to say, okay, I'm gonna Me Too myself out in the world. But and it may not ever be the right time, and there's no shame in that. But for folks that have spoken out, and for folks that attend this event, even if they aren't speaking out or even haven't had these experiences, but are allies, I think this is a really important moment to come together and to support ourselves and each other and to organize around this issue. And I encourage you to learn from history and from the people at this panel and in this audience about the ways that you can contribute to this really important moment in history. And I do think it's an important historical moment on a par with when Anita Hill spoke out and on a par with what happened in the early 70s. And I have a lot of analysis around that, but this panel is not for my analysis. It is for the analysis of the people here. So I'm going to now turn it over, and we're going to start at the far end of the podium or of the table with for one student student and one postdoc from UMass. Christy, who is a fourth-year chemistry PhD student at the end, and Joelle, who is an NSF postdoctoral research fellow in physics, who have organized a hashtag Safe at Work campaign at University of Massachusetts. And then after they'd organized this campaign, Me Too happened, and that really jump-started their campaign. So I want to ask the two of you, how did you come to organize that campaign, and how has the emergence of Me Too last fall influenced your work around these issues?
So we are actually, the reason that we came about to this subject matter is because that we are executive board members in an organization, Graduate Women in STEM, and we have been dealing for maybe 5 years now with issues regarding women in STEM fields where we're very underrepresented and are subject to a lot of the same power dynamics that manifest in lots of different ways, including sexual harassment and assault in the workplace. And this the Safe at Work campaign actually started because the committee that started it, which has now become advocacy, used to be professional development. And women were coming to us and were like, well, I don't really need more professional development. What I need is somebody to break down the brick walls that people keep putting in my way. I'm skilled, I'm awesome, I'm so fabulous. I'm smarter than most of my classmates. What's happening? I don't need any more skills. And we were like, you know what, that's true, right? So in this time, right now, what professional development looks like in the context of women in STEM and in fields where women are sort of disempowered by the culture, looks like advocacy. And then women after women started coming out of the woodwork and just telling us all these stories about sexual harassment and in some cases assault, and about how the university was complicit in some cases and at the very least wasn't doing enough to try and address the problem. And so we're like, well, if you set your lab on fire, they're on your case immediately. And things that are considered work safety issues are taken so seriously. And if you don't do your work safety training, they come and they collect your keys and they lock you out. And we're like, why isn't this a work safety issue? Why isn't the issue of women's protection and our ability to occupy our spaces and to work safely there and to be free from fear and intimidation and in some cases physical assault, why isn't that a work safety issue held to the same magnitude as the other work safety issues? So Safe at Work was born. I'll let Chrissy tell you about the magazine that we put together, but in terms of the way that the Me Too movement started amplifying our campaign, it was because the temptation is always to say, that's a few people, and we kept getting questions like, how big of a problem is this really? And then Me Too made it very clear that it's a really big problem, and it's not a few people, and it's not a few people that are affected, and it's not a few people that are perpetrating, and so it was really lucky timing for us.
Yeah, I like the way you've phrased it to me before, which is that we sort of put this magazine out into the world and the universe backed us up in a big way. Yeah, so for a while we had been writing this magazine called Graduate Women in STEM Quarterly Magazine, and we'd been also sort of in parallel with professional development moving towards more advocacy-focused issues, because that's where the women, our members, really they were passionate about that and they really connected with that. And actually, we started this in the summer of 2016. Just all of these women, as they came to trust us and our organization a little more, were coming forward with these stories. And we just felt that we wanted to empower them, to give them a venue to speak out and to show them, physically put them with other people and show them you're not alone, and show other people, look at the magnet. We were really happy that this had some heft and we could put it down and say, look, this is happening here. Read these stories, connect with these people. And Me Too kind of came about. So this was published in the end of August 2017, and so Me Too came about in mid-October. So this was, people were starting to kind of ask us about this, and, you know, a lot of people were just in the space of, you know, what, we don't know what to do, like, we want to help, but we didn't even realize, we don't know, we're lost. And so the Me Too really amplified that feeling of like, yes, this is something we need to address. So our campaign has kind of taken off from there in terms of figuring out how to fix this through, you know, institutional methods, policies, and also creating culture change.
So what kinds of things are you doing to create that culture change in new policies?
We have these sort of like weekly meetings where we all come together and discuss all of the different things that are happening, and they're happening on lots of different levels. One thing that we're trying to do a lot of is interface between the student body and the university administration. So we've recently been appointed to a task force that was convened by the UMass Chancellor on sexual violence, and we're really like taking apart the issue and trying to figure out what are the structural elements of the way that we live and exist in the university that allow this to be so widespread. And it's a really difficult conversation to have because information is not very easy to put together. Particularly, I mean, the university is like an enormous institution, and there's so many moving parts, and it's really difficult to narrow down like where exactly the problems lie. And so that task force has been very helpful for us to be able to actually get in the room with the people who are the decision makers and who have the ability to sign things and make them happen. And but they can only change the things that are mandated. They can't really change the culture very easily. That has to happen on like a grassroots effort. So peer education, like we've been designing a bunch of new workshop materials. One of them is like our take on active bystander intervention, which we don't necessarily love because inside the context of your work environment, you're not really a bystander. You're not like some person at the train station who is like in superhero mode jumping in to save somebody who's being wronged. Like you're subject to the same power dynamics and the same socio-political trickiness that the person who's being harassed is. And so what do you do? And like peer defense is about recontextualizing that concept of a bystander and examining how we all have like power, privilege, and how we're all complicit in some way, and like how to get our heads around that in order to actually make change.
It's been really informative to look into. There's a lot of assumptions. Like there was one thing that stuck out in particular was that a lot of people assumed there was a policy on relationships between faculty and students. Like it was sort of everyone I'd talked to, and I'd heard that there was a policy when I started working as a TA, say, oh yeah, no, there's a university policy, faculty can't have relationships with students. Didn't exist.
It
does now. It does now. That's one of the things we've been working on, but there's just a lot of assumptions, a lack of transparency that's been tough to work through, but I think that transparency is really powerful in giving people, bringing stuff from the administration to our members and helping people understand, because the sexual harassment and violence is bad enough, and then you go to the process of like when you find yourself in a position to speak up or report, it's hugely more complicated from that point. So that's been another big thing we've been trying to deal with is once someone is able to come forward and report, what is their experience and how can we actually make that effective?
It's an issue that we run into a lot in places where we're minorities. So the problem with being a minority is that the greater good is never really geared towards your needs. And so we come up against that a lot, the idea of like how to amplify the experiences of people who occupy such little space within the environment and like try to make that a priority for people who, I mean, it would be really easy to ignore us, and as like the history of violence and power, abuse of power has shown us, like it's really difficult to sort of like rage against that machine and win. And so we've been trying to focus our like scientific minds on like how we actually figure out how things are connected and like where the trigger points are, like where are the linchpins, where are the places where we can apply pressure to like actually move this system. And it's really heavy and there's a lot of inertia. So like that's part of the reason that we've come here. This is another thing that we're doing. We're trying really hard to connect out with lots of people, because maybe there aren't very many women like in our immediate environment, but there are lots of women everywhere who have a lot to add to this, and getting everybody together and making those connections has helped a lot. Yeah. So thank you for having us here.
You're part of a long tradition of women working in male-dominated fields to try to break through. And, you know, a lot of the resistance is about not wanting to share the power. Those are high status, high paying, well-benefited jobs. And, you know, whether it's on a construction site or in a lab or, you know, and there's a lot of resistance to sharing that power and those benefits. And so you're up, again, I think, against some of the hardest barriers working in the fields that you're working in, but more power to you. Our next panelist is Tom Schiff, an adjunct professor of social justice education and public education at UMass and a longtime activist and educator working with men and boys on developing healthy masculinities. So Tom, my question to you is, what is the role of men and male allies in the Me Too movement?
Well, it's a great question. I want to start by first, I just want to thank you all for inviting me here. And I want to acknowledge that as you, in your introduction, you talked about all of the women and folks of color, women of color, and queer folks who have been taking leadership in this arena forever. So it's an honor to be here with you all. In particular, I really appreciate the great work that you all are doing, and you as well. But you didn't speak yet, so. The role, there's a number of things. I think that when you asked me to speak about the role of allyship, I do need to say, one of the things I want to say is that, so I'm not going to be able to talk about the hordes of lives that have been shattered due to single allegations, because that's fake news, obviously. Yeah, exactly. But what it does highlight, and I think it's important for us to think about, is how we need to push back against pushback, because inevitably there is that pushback, and that type of languaging and the type of pushback that we're hearing from particular people, and many people, is the same language that is used by batterers, or the same tactics that are used by batterers: denial, minimization, victim blaming. And I think it's really important to be able to have that framework, because that is also, I would add that was another place where a lot of that work came from, was from
Yes,
battered women's work, battered women's movement. So I guess I feel like there's two basic areas where I think it's important in terms of male involvement, male allyship. One is to listen to and believe survivors. We don't need to question whether somebody was loud enough, whether they waited too long to say something, whether they didn't say, "I'm not comfortable," at a timely or loud way. All we have to do is listen and believe and support. The other area, I think, is how we engage with other men and boys. How do we talk with each other? How do we ask each other what are the types of men we want to be? How do we want to be in the world? How do we have conversations about consent, about respect, about boundaries, about relationships, and on and on. And I think that we need to pull other men into it, and we need to insist that we pull them in. Or be insistent about that, no, you're going to do this. And we have lots of areas of influence, but we don't have all the same areas, right? So how do we have those conversations and pull people in? How do we talk with younger men understanding that this is not, when I say talk with, it's not a one-off conversation. It's an ongoing, continuous conversation. Obviously, it's been happening for centuries, and we need to continue to be part of that. As we've been asked to by women, queer folks, folks of color, for many, many years. So that's part of what it's an important thing to do, and that we do this in both public spaces. And by public spaces, I don't necessarily mean here, but I also mean like in meetings where a man talks over a woman, and naming that and calling that out and challenging that, and inviting them to be different, but also in public spaces such as when you're hanging out with your friends, you're hanging out at the bar, you're hanging out in a class, you're in the locker room. We could have a different kind of locker room talk, right? I seem to be targeting somebody, and I'm sorry. I mean, I have sheets of things I could talk about, so I don't know if there's how else you want to frame this.
Well, we'll open it up, and you can maybe
Okay.
bring in some other, unless.
One of the things I do want to mention something particularly, some research that's happened recently.
Great.
So MTV and the Public Religion Research Institute, have any of you seen this study? It came out in the last few months. They did a youth survey, and they I don't know how many folks they did, lots of folks, and they predominantly, if anybody's interested in the larger study, it's about discrimination, prejudice, attitudes of young people around these issues. And the study is really folks ages, I think, 18 to 25. So part of the analysis that some folks are having, including myself, about this, that it actually is convincing some young men to rethink, that Me Too is actually convincing some young men to think about how they are in the world. So, for example, according to the study, 1 in 3 of the young men who did this study, ages 18 to 25, have thought back and wondered whether an interaction they had with someone could be perceived as sexual harassment. 40% of young men agreed that thinking about these issues changed the way they behaved in potential romantic relationships. And a quarter said they'd seen changes in other people's behaviors because of the Me Too campaign. And I guess I'd add to that, just like always, feminist movements create change. In addition, 75% of the respondents believe that there's at least some, so this is a sort of a different piece of this. And this is about, how the work that I do is a lot about thinking about how masculinity is performance and how behaviors are scripted. And so we have these scripts of how we think we're supposed to behave and how we're supposed to act. And so 75% of young people believe that at least there's some pressure for men to act in traditionally masculine ways. With that pressure, meaning about half of the respondents said that meant that the pressure to conform to conventional notions of masculinity limits the type of friendships men that can have with other men, encourages sexually aggressive behavior, encourages homophobic attitudes, and encourages violent behavior in general. And women actually, this study was broken down in a binary fashion. Women were more likely to concur with those findings than men who responded to it were. But there still were pretty high findings for men. And there's other research that backs up all that sort of work, that men who buy into more traditional ways of thinking about being masculine are more likely to have worse health outcomes, to be more aggressive, be more likely to engage in all forms of violence, take risks with their own and other people's health, so forth.
Great.
Sorry.
Great. Okay. So next, Laura Briggs, who's chair of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at UMass. And can you speak about the movement, where the movement goes from here and the challenges of building a movement like this?
Thanks so much to Leo Wong, to Linda McCarthy for having us here. But especially it's an honor to be among student activists who are addressing these issues and postdoc activists.
Wasn't that long since I was a student?
Because what I'm going to say, you already know, which is a hashtag is not a movement. And Me Too can follow the brilliance of Black Lives Matter and understand that hashtags mobilize people. Hashtags change attitudes. I think that Me Too has changed people's sense that every woman who complains, or every person who complains about sexual harassment or other kinds of sexual violence, is an outlier and an individual and probably did something wrong. And I can't describe to you what a sea change that feels like. As somebody who's been talking and thinking about sexual harassment and other kinds of sexual violence since the 80s, like this sense that you can always minimize what happened to somebody, or you can always prioritize his career over what happened to her, or that it's always okay that the student who was sexually assaulted is the one who leaves because they have an emotional problem and he may or may not have done it. I think it's just possible, for this moment at least, we're not there. And that's incredible. But the thing that is good, but because it's a hashtag movement, because it's a movement in the media, what the media gives us, the media can take away, right? As long as it's controlled outside of the grassroots, we don't own this, nothing happens that's sustainable. And the key thing is exactly what you all are doing, which is exactly what the movement for Black Lives showed us, is that how you sustain this activism is in local face-to-face groups. That's where change happens. The second thing I want to say is there's a sense that has been fostered by the media that we just didn't know. We never heard this before. Of course, that's not true. From go, that's not true. And but I also want to hold up that there are real concrete enemies of this movement that we want to be aware of. I was just reading something from the 80s about the chant, Fight the Right. I want to talk about the right-wing opposition to speaking about and thinking about sexual violence. One of the things that we learned from both the Rob Porter case and the Larry Nassar case is that in both cases, women went to the pastors of particularly their Christian evangelical churches and said, this is happening, I'm really distressed, I want to know what to do. And were essentially told to minimize it, to suck it up, that they could not do anything because men were legitimately the heads of their households, or that challenging him and his career was not okay. And that's not a problem limited to men on the Christian right. When we look at Health and Human Services, the Department of Health and Human Services at the federal level, or the Department of Education, we see that the Trump administration has appointed quite a number of right-wing women who sort of cut their teeth on anti-abortion and making it impossible for trans folks to go to the bathroom. And one of their key issues is minimizing rape and sexual harassment. Betsy DeVos challenging the use of Title IX in colleges and universities and schools as a tool for insisting that women and girls are not, cannot be equal, do not have equal access to the facilities of our institutions of higher education as long as they're being sexually harassed, raped, and otherwise experiencing sexual violence. So Betsy DeVos is explicitly an enemy of this. She says women mostly lie about rape, and that what they're really talking about is bad sex and bad experiences where everybody was drunk. There are other Christian right women appointed to Health and Human Services who've taken the same position. And I'm talking about publicly. I'm not trying to impugn somebody's character or say that because of their religious affiliation, they're bad people. I'm talking about an organized, thoughtful, political campaign by the Christian right that moves alongside the anti-abortion activism and is explicitly aimed at minimizing the effectiveness of campaigns against sexual violence and sexual harassment. So I want to remind us that there are people who are against this. It's not just, we never thought of it. It's that they really want to minimize it because it's legitimate. Women and other people are legitimately, in their minds, the subject of sexual harassment and sexual violence. The third thing I want to mention is there are also social media platforms that are promoting this kind of activity. I'm thinking of especially sites on Reddit, like Red Pill and Pickup Artists, PUA, that are moving quite separately from the evangelical Christian networks that seem to be begun out of men who, or adult men or young men who feel like it's really hard to have a heterosexual relationship. And so the kinds of conversations that are taking place on these social media platforms are women are biologically different from men, and how their biology is constituted is that they need to be dominated. And the reason you're not picking people up is you're being nice. And you need to be violent, you need to be very assertive. There's tons and tons of sexual harassment also going on Twitter. These are commercial platforms that are sponsoring this kind of speech. And we have some models about how to challenge it. Particularly the press has been challenging Twitter to address its sexual harassment problem. And folks in New Hampshire, not far from here, actually found that the founder of Red Pill, one of these social media platforms, a subreddit, was a state legislator. And so they called for his ouster, and they succeeded. And I want to be very clear that I'm not talking about free speech here. People are making money off of these platforms, and they set limits on what kinds of speech they are legitimately going to make money off of. We have an obligation to stand up and say, not that kind of speech, because what's happening on those platforms is essentially conspiring to commit rape, sexual violence, and sexual harassment. And we don't have to agree that that's going to be part of our social media environment. 4, I would say we also need to be well aware that who the victims are of sexual violence are plural. That virtually every gay man I know has been subject to sexual harassment and sexual violence. An extraordinary number of boys have been subject to sexual harassment and sexual violence. And I think we can struggle a little around the language of believe women or believe girls, and be aware that queer folks of all sorts and trans folks are disproportionately targeted. And beyond that, I would say the other thing we're learning is, well, I suppose something we've always known and always done. We need to be very active about supporting reporters. The Larry Nassar case reminded us of some social science, that children who are being sexually abused, on average, tell 7 people before somebody intervenes. And so the sense that there's like all this hysteria that once there's a report, all hell breaks loose is not true. We need to be mindful that it's hard to report, and that reporters are not being believed. And so that tells us something about what our face-to-face groups need to be doing. And finally, we need to be involved in the implementation of how we address these rules or how we address these problems. The concern about moral panic is being raised in particular by queer folk, because queer folk have disproportionately been the target of false allegations. Due process, and I'm not quoting Trump here, Trump raised questions about due process in his own White House. I don't understand. He was in charge. But due process actually super matters, right? Because false allegations do happen, and the success of previous backlashes has been around finding the tiny number of false allegations, bringing them to the fore, and using it to paint an entire movement as being about being false. The other thing, though, is we're not going to build a mass movement, or especially a multiracial movement, if we're not thoughtful about the kinds of things we're asking for. One of the things that made me really squirm around the Larry Nassar sentencing, while it was thrilling to hear survivors come forward and tell their stories, there was this sense that if we could just send him to jail for the longest possible imaginable kind of time, that victory would be had. And I think we want to be really thoughtful about how we're talking about cages. We are mostly putting it, to the extent that people who have been convicted of sexual violence are being sent to jail, they're mostly being sent to jail for short amounts of time. And what we know is that putting people in cages does not get rid of violence, it concentrates violence. And one of the things that emerged as a huge conflict in the battered women's movement in the 1980s that pitted many white women against some women of color was this question of whether what we wanted was more police involvement and more sending people to jail, more batterers to jail. I think we really need to have a serious conversation about what due process looks like and what kind of outcomes we want. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Laura. That was great. So I'm going to open it up now to the audience for questions.
For Broken Silence, are there copies that can be distributed or found online?
Oh, yeah.
It's online, right?
It is online. If you want, I brought some of our postcards. They've got our magazine website, gqmag.org. Not Gentleman's Quarterly, Glu's Quarterly. Yes, we did that on purpose. And we have a couple of copies of the magazine, but we're just discovered that actually we've given them pretty much all out. So we have a couple of them, and it's definitely online. And Broken Silence is available for everybody to read, and also if you want to contribute, you can still do that.
In addition, there are some great organizations working particularly with college students, like Know Your Nine. So it's no as in no, and nine IX. Know Your Nine meaning Title IX. And then also End Rape on Campus. Those are two groups started by students that were organizing long before Me Too. One thing that I want folks to be clear on is Me Too. There was a movement before Me Too, and that movement is deep and long and has been going on for many years, but there's been a lot of activism around sexual assault on college campuses in the last 10 years, and that really, I think, laid the foundation for a lot of what's going on today. Other questions?
I think where the systemic problem still lies within our community and within our culture is that we have women coming in who are still saying, I'm so ashamed, I'm so embarrassed, how did this happen to me? How did I get here? And really it has to, I think the responsibility still lies on the survivor to be the one to report, to be the one to say, this happened to me. And it's very shameful, it's not, but they feel very shamed. And so I love that we're putting the responsibility back on the potential perpetrators. And I'm not just isolating men, I don't mean to do that. But it's really important, I think, that our culture shifts and understands that women who are in that position have so much against them already, and then to have to be the ones to take responsibility, I think it's ill-placed.
Fallacies is a men's health dialogue and theater program. We offer dialogue processes. We do training, consulting, speaking, workshops, and we also do theater presentations. We're working on something with some of these folks here for, I don't know when, May, up in it's going to be someplace in Franklin County. I don't know where it's going to be. Someplace in Franklin County. We're still working on it. And essentially what we do is we meet on a regular basis. We do dialogue on a variety of issues related to masculinities. And I say masculinities, I use the plural for what many folks have already said, because obviously other identities fit into that, are part of that. So we have to also talk about how that intersects with race and class and sexuality and religion and so forth, and health and violence and relationships, and out of that we write performance pieces. And we're always looking for members. So just thought I'd mention that part. So that's the work that we do, and I appreciate you saying that. It comes back to what I was saying before about believing that we need to rewrite the scripts around masculinities, that the scripts that we've been given are really problematic for so many issues within our culture, as well, along with many other things, but that's one aspect of it.
So this is an awkward one because it's not a very popular thing to talk about, right? It's very easy to focus on the way that men rage violence against women, and we rarely ever speak about the violence that we perpetrate against each other. Yep. And that is a really big part of this problem. It is very tempting to believe when you're in a situation where you're disempowered that the way to exert power is to disempower someone else further and sort of climb over them. And I recognize that that's part of the power structure. That's what they want from us. They want us to trample each other on the way up, right? But it is that's one of the things that has become so clear to us throughout the course of this campaign and through engaging with this issue, is that women need to examine our own complicity. And that does not mean watch what we're wearing or what we're saying. It means being careful about how we participate in furthering the cultures that oppress us and other women. It's very simple to think that okay, well, if there were just more female professors, if there were just more women mentors, if there were just more women, that things would be different. But we're all socialized the same way. And we need to work very hard to overcome the barrier to trusting each other. We don't want to be saying things like what one of my female mentors said to me, which is oh, you look like you would put up with being sexually assaulted. Right? And that was a woman. That was a person that, I don't trust Betsy DeVos. I did trust her. Mm-hmm. And those are the kinds of things that when you hear these things from your mentors and your friends, and people who you think are going to understand, you internalize them. And that's sometimes more dangerous than hearing it from somebody who's not like you. So we need to be really careful about that. And everybody needs to think about, regardless of whether or not we want to, we often participate in this culture, and culture can't exist without our participation. So the fact that this is a culture, it means that we're all responsible for part of it. And I think that men have a lot of work to do, and you unfortunately have a lot of work to do to overcome the things that you've been taught, but we also have been taught things that we need to think about. So I just wanted to add that.
But I noticed after the Me Too campaign really happened in October, which is that within the women that were speaking or not speaking, there was this pushback around you shouldn't force women to feel like they need to speak up, and then backlash against that. But this is a movement if we all come together. And so how to support women and all victims when there's division between them after they've even had the same experiences, and bringing compassion and empathy into that, and recognizing and allowing people to know and recognize and accept the fact that people have different recovery and healing. And so that's a thought and the question.
I think that if I can echo some of this about how survivors are also targeting each other, that one of the things that makes us feel safe is if we can identify what the person who got hurt did wrong, right? And I don't think that we all got to feel isolated and ashamed and feel that this was an individualized experience by ourselves, right? And that part of what we're trying to figure out now in the aftermath of Me Too is it possible to have a public conversation that somehow moves us out of the space of shame? One of the things I was thinking about as we were talking that I couldn't figure out how it fit, it felt like it didn't fit at all, is I am having an absolute blast talking to my 7-year-old son about toxic masculinity. Our conversations are hilarious, and he's furious about toxic masculinity, but then I don't know if it affects me, but what about if I have to get drafted? That's about toxic masculinity, and all these guys getting... So anyway, and why are there only boys who play wall ball, and how do girls get into the game? One of the things I'm trying to figure out is, how do we make this fun? What makes activism sustainable is that it's fun. And there's a sense that when we talk about experiences of sexual violence and sexual harassment, it can only be in this really heavy, like, just barely lifted out of the shame kind of way. And I don't have a strategy, but I want to leave you all with this question. Like, I know that political movements last because they make people feel better, because they do something that makes us happy that we went to the meeting.
I think that's why the comedians are so important right now. I mean, John Oliver literally got me through the election. Like, I would not have survived at all without him. And there are lots of comedians who have definitely found a way to highlight both the seriousness and the absurdity of a lot of the things that we know are true about ourselves. And it's funny because it's true is having a moment again. Yeah, so that's one of the ways, maybe.
I appreciate what you're saying, and how do we do this in ways that are trauma informed?
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, because one part of what I heard your statement was about, there's almost like there was a pressure to come out. Yeah, me too. It was like not everybody wants to do that, and there were I had a number of folks that on Facebook that were saying, okay, I got to sign off for a while, right? Because hearing all these stories is triggering me in ways that I don't want to be triggered right now. As a survivor, this is just I just gotta I gotta take care of myself. So how do we continue to have those conversations? How do we and that movement in ways that are it's got to be. You're right. There's got to be ways that it's engaging and fun, and also taking care. I mean, part of that has to be about taking care of each other as well.
I just feel like the national conversation is very binary, and I'm just wondering how we can kind of make space for people with non-binary identities and trans men and queer men and other people who have really complicated relationships to toxic masculinity and experiences of abuse and harassment, without derailing the crucial focus on misogyny and sexism.
I know that our name is the Graduate Women in STEM, but we actually do a lot of this work. And I'm sorry that we didn't mention it earlier, but I think that the way that we try to tackle this is by focusing on the power dynamics, because the power dynamics affect everybody with a marginalized identity. So even international students benefit a lot from our work because international students are vulnerable in other ways, right? And we have actually a lot of non-binary and and trans and different types of genders and gender identities and phenotypes and things like that in our leadership that we consult when we talk about these things. But there's no good language that we've found that always works. And so if you have suggestions about what's a better way to have this conversation in this, we would really love to hear it, because we struggle with this all the time. And every event that we have, we always have to have a 15-minute spiel about how our name might be excluding people, and we take the word woman very openly, and I don't have language for that, but I would love to.
Part of what you brought up to me is part of the limitations in our culture, because I think our culture is very binary in our thinking. And I'm not talking about how we think about gender. I'm talking about we talk about everything, right? And so we have to be able to break through that as well. So it's not, it's not that there's people who are survivors and people who are perpetrators, because there's plenty of folks who fit into multiple categories of that, right? And to understand how we talk about that, and in the same way that we had this conversation about this around, how do we add multiplicity to it, and also, and this is kind of what I'm hearing from you, is how do we add multiplicity to the conversation, and also at the same time continue to look at those power dynamics around misogyny, around transphobia, around whatever it is that those pieces are and how they intersect too. So in the same way that Black Lives Matter is not saying that other lives don't matter, right? They're saying we need to look at this, because this is something that's right here, but we understand that there's so many intersecting dynamics to it too. So I'm not sure I'm fully responding to your question, because there's a lot there. It was a great question, and I think that it's and I'll speak for myself, it's an interesting place to be, because there's parts of it where I'm trying to figure out how to both stay in my lane, right, in terms of my work, because I also feel like, well, who am I to be saying something? But I also need to also name dynamics at the same time.
Well, as I was saying, sexual harassment and assault is about power, and the studies show that way disproportionately LGBTQ people are targeted, or girls with disabilities, or so looking at those intersecting relationships of power, and how this sexual assault and abuse is a tool to that people use to reinforce those systems of power, and thinking again how those things intersect, I think, is critical.
So is there a way that you have discovered that you can open up the conversation to our children to show them how to behave as a young gentleman, or what not to take as a young lady?
What my kid would say is that an understanding of sexism as sexism is really, really helpful. He says, some parents don't tell their kids about sexism, and there's so much they don't understand.
So cute.
No, but it's so helpful to him to understand, why are boys playing so rough? Why am I coming home with bruises? I'm finding that I don't have it. I want a group to talk about this, right? I think we need to talk to each other as parents, because I feel like this conversation is nowhere. In terms of the parents I'm talking to, even, those who are feminists or queer or who I love. But we're all buying these violent toys for our kids, especially our boys, and then being like, I don't understand why they're not more gentle. But I'm finding that teaching my kid to operate this language of toxic masculinity is helping us, because his tendency would be to say, they're kind of, for every step forward for girls, it's a step back for boys, and trying to say, no, I want you to step up and be the guy who says, why are there no girls in wall ball? That owning that is really important. But I love the question. I think we need to talk to each other as parents a ton about it, because none of us are figuring this out on our own, and I don't think we do well at all. I mean, the stuff about teach your kid that nobody can touch them except in their bathing suit area, that's it. That's like the whole extent of our conversation. Great, right? I mean, not that that's trivial, but like, then how do I say to my kid, I'm having so much fun saying to my kid, no, I am not going to drive over 15,000 people in the parking lot so that you can be the first person to get to the door. Because stupid competitiveness, it's a hallmark of toxic masculinity. And I noticed that you're not listening when your friend says, no, he doesn't want to play chess. Running over somebody else's no, that's a hallmark of toxic masculinity. And also, I'm going to keep going. I got to stop. But 30 more seconds is, we teach boys and girls to get their free will run over all the time, and we start it when they're toddlers, right? We don't ask them before we pick them up. We don't ask for consent when we tickle them, and just teaching them that they can say no is also part of teaching them how to listen to no.
There's layers of how do we get involved in, because this is also community efforts, right? So how do we advocate for comprehensive sexual health education, K through 12 and more? And I don't mean, like we teach health in horrible ways in this country. We don't talk about sex and sexuality. When we talk about comprehensive sexual health education, so we're then talking about all sexualities. We're talking about how that intersects with racism and sexism and transphobia and so forth. So how do we, so as parents, if we have the time, because a lot of us like, well, yeah, but I got to go to work. But how do we advocate for these things happening in our schools as well? Starting at kindergarten.
How can we help the dialogue around sexual assault and sex work?
I think that we've got to get rid of the idea of people who are legitimate victims, and that certain kinds of activities make you a victim. I don't want to keep talking too much, but it's super important, because sex workers need to be central to how all of us think about this question, because as long as sex workers are vulnerable, everybody's vulnerable, because sex workers are exactly where the culture meets the limits of its thinking about sexual violence, right? If you say yes under certain circumstances, then you must always mean yes. If you are in public, then you're always vulnerable. If you are a certain kind of human, then you cannot be raped. As long as that's the case, we have no movement of any value against sexual violence.
And again, it speaks to the larger issue around holding folks responsible who are the perpetrators of violence, because we do so much victim blaming all the time.
Inherently, in being trauma informed, there's not a necessity to ask somebody their story and pressure them to tell it, because there's an understanding that it may not be emotionally safe for them, or in some cases realistically physically safe, or financially safe. There's so many reasons and so many different stories. But what I wanted to say also is that I think that just as there has to be acknowledgement and respect for all of those people who are coming forth with their stories publicly, there has to be acknowledgement and respect for the people that are behind the scenes for whatever reason that they're there, and I'm sure, I would imagine, and appreciating that this is rising up so that it doesn't happen again. And I just wish there was a more kindness around that, and I totally agree with what you said. It's, there's got to be more kindness and compassion.
You're so right there. There's so many people who can't do this. So part of what we included in here was we called it a visual moment of silence. So just a blank page for all of the people who couldn't share their stories, even anonymously in here. But I think what you brought up about kindness and about it being a complicated issue kind of links to a lot of the things we've been talking about, which is that it's okay to admit that we are talking about something huge and complicated and socially ingrained, that you can't talk about sexual violence without talking about gender identity, and you can't talk about it without talking about racism and classism and how we socialize children. And I think it's okay to kind of be kind to each other and be kind to ourselves in saying, like, we're not perfect at having these conversations yet, but to keep connecting with people and trying to get better at it, and just sort of that admittance of nuance. And it's okay as long as you don't use it as an excuse to say, oh, well, it's hard, so, whatever I say, don't take it the wrong way. So not to excuse people who say problematic things, but trying to be kind to each other and say, like, hey, you might not have realized, but what you just said was problematic, or what you said was very binary and exclusionary, and sort of being accepting of that in movements, and also like being that for other people when you need to be.
I was reading the New York Times magazine this weekend about the prevalence and accessibility of pornography and how it's shaping the sexual attitudes of our children, and the coursework that they're doing at one or two of the Boston high schools. I was wondering if you have any more information about any type of programming like that, or if that and how that fits in with the work you're doing and impacting this issue.
There's a program at a BU that they're doing in the school. That's the thing that you're talking about, and they call it porn literacy. And actually, if you go to our website, we have a piece that we wrote about 5 years ago called Porn Literacy. So that's why I had to contact them. They thought I was looking for their curriculum. I just wanted to have a connection. But I think that we have such a difficult time talking about sexuality and in our culture, and so we don't talk about it, and so young people are seeking information elsewhere, and that information that they're finding is based in misogyny and racism and all levels of oppression, as well as, and part of that is also about commodifying people, right? So I think that I don't know of other work that's happening in this area, in that arena. Other folks know. I think that's one of those places where people are really afraid to talk about pornography. I think, to have real conversations about what it is, but I do think that a literacy around it. It's not like it's. I'm trying to think what the numbers are, exact numbers, but it's high 90s for men using pornography at some point. We actually, when I was at UMass, we did a survey, and I think it was. I'm trying to think what the numbers were. There was a few men who had never used pornography, never viewed it, but most were viewing. Their first viewing was middle school, right? So I mean, part of that is if you have a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old, is are you having conversations with them? Are you checking what they're seeing online? I mean, it's hard to do that all the time, but there's also ways that you can think about that, and what are the messages they're getting from that, and how does that relate to how they really feel, and how does it relate to the toxic masculinities or aspects of toxic masculinity that Laura's son already is so well versed in knowing about. I mean, I think it's really challenging. And the other part of that is that for some folks, I've had conversations, for example, with. I think it's changing, but I'd say 15 years ago, there were plenty of gay men that were saying, this is the first place that I was able to see, somebody like me engaging sexually, right? So how do we, it's not going away, so are there ways that we can engage with it to make it better? Not really, again, I'm staying in my lane, but how do we actually have more literacy around it too? There's actually a professor of communications at UMass. No, not well. That no. What's her name? She's done a lot. They did a lot of work around that. I can't think of her name off the top of my head.
The things that we know to say to our kids about sexuality is like how reproduction happens, and how sexually transmitted diseases happen. And, you know, that takes 15 minutes, and then what do you do for the next 18 years, right? So, like, I actually think it's hilarious to talk to our kids about sexuality, and I understand. My oldest came to me from foster care and from a really difficult history, so she sure had a language for sex that she wanted to talk about. So that was my first moment of parenting around this. But I think we need to talk a lot about what's healthy sex, what's fun sex, and be really open. My 7-year-old knows that pornography exists because he goes on the internet, and I tell him, like, I want you to, I've got parental controls on your YouTube viewing because there are images of people having sex that are kind of gross, and you don't have to watch them. So that's the 7-year-old conversation about porn. I don't know what the 13 and 15-year-old conversation with boys is about porn, but I think it's one that we need to have a lot. And maybe our kids will be consumers of porn, and maybe that's not the worst thing. I think we just have to have an expansive, an ability to have some kind of conversation with them about pleasure and desire and fun and safety.
I'm not going to tackle the porn issue, but one thing that I have a brother who's much younger than me, and he and I have a lot of conversations about what it means to be a man, and he's got a lot of big sisters, so in a lot of ways, like, he had to figure that out pretty quickly, and we're all very strong-willed and vocal, so he got a pretty good education about what happens when you push around a girl. But one of the things that I thought was interesting, and actually, like, there's a third campaign chair for Safe at Work, and she, like, couldn't be here. You would have loved her. She's awesome. But she, at one point, like, pointed something out to me, which is that there are lots and lots of ways that we learn about power that have nothing to do with sex, and that, like, sometimes just finding the counter messages for those things can help. Like, we were gonna go to a movie, and then she was like, I'm not watching that, that's brogramming, right? Like, and I was like, brogramming, what is that? But I started, like, thinking about it, and it's true, right? We get these, like, messages of, like, what it means to be powerful. There's a hero, he's violent, he breaks the rules, he runs into places slinging guns, he's probably got abs, he's probably cute, he's probably sleeping with lots of women. But that's, like, how we perceive masculinity, and there are counter messages out there. It's just that it's really difficult to find them because they're not as popular. But I think that, like, some of the newer programming is doing a good job of that. Like, have you seen Supergirl? She's pretty awesome, and, like, you know, like, it's really cool to see how, like, there is a new interpretation of what it means to be a hero, and how it doesn't have to be about, like, traditionally kicking butt, but there are, like, other aspects. And I think that maybe, like, outside, if you don't, like, aren't quite ready for the porn discussion, like, that might be a good place to start. Like, what does it mean to be a man? And, like, you know, in Supergirl, the main characters who are male, like, support the female hero, and, like, they have their places, and they're very secure in their place in the world, and they but it's, like, a cool message, and it's different than things that we were seeing, like, a few years ago. So
My 11-year-old loves Supergirl.
Me too.
And in that study, one of the things that also they were talking about in that article, they were talking about how the guys that were, like, middle school or high school that she was talking to, they were afraid of sex from having watched pornography. So I think it's incredible. It's really incredibly important to have those conversations.
So we have run out of time, but I'd like to thank all of our panelists.